Welcome to the Mindflick Podcast. The Mindflick Podcast explores the psychology of high performance, focusing on the mindset shifts, leadership decisions, and personal turning points that shape how people think, lead, and grow. I'm Sir Andrew Strauss, Chairman of Mindflick.
And I'm Pete Lindsay, performance psychologist and co-founder at Mindflick. And we'll be taking you inside the mindset shifts that have shaped some of the best minds in both sport and business. And we'll blend that thought leadership with real-life stories, bringing performance psychology to life in a way that's practical, human, and impactful.
Every episode, we will sit down with leaders, athletes, and change makers to uncover the turning points, the pressure moments, and the crucial experiences that define their journey. Joining us for the inaugural episode of the Mindflick Podcast is Dr Mark Bawden, someone that Pete and I know extremely well through our various careers before Mindflick, but now Mark is the CEO of Mindflick. We had an extraordinary conversation with him, really, because although we know him very well, we saw, I suppose, in some ways, a different side to Mark. There were some fascinating insights there into his motivation for getting into psychology and a very deeply personal story. So a thoroughly enjoyable first episode.
And Strauss, as we kind of explored the different turning points that Mark shared with us, everything from, developing the yips as a young cricketer through to the loss of his father, and the shifts in his practice as a performance psychologist, working at the very highest levels. I think there's a lot in there for us to take away and consider it from our perspective. He gave us little insights into changes in mindset when he focuses on, where he focuses as a psychologist. Do you focus on what needs fixing, or do you focus on what's already working well?
Yeah, absolutely. And for anyone who's interested in high performance and how you view the world, if you want to perform at a high level consistently, I think there were some real gold nuggets in there. So we hope you enjoy our first Mindflick podcast episode. Okay, Mark, well, a very warm welcome to the inaugural Mindflick podcast. It is an absolute pleasure to have you on the show as our first guest. Pete and I obviously know you very well, but for the audience, can you just start off by giving a little bit of a sort of background to who you are, what you're best known for, and what you are doing now?
No worries. Well, guys, first off, thanks for inviting me. Thanks for letting me make selection. I wondered whether I'd make selection for this, which is dead cool. So really happy about that. I am Dr. Mark Bawden. I'm probably best known for my work as a sports psychologist, which I did for many years, which is obviously where I connected in with you two guys. And my current role, as I like to describe it as, is the current CEO of Mindflick, unless you two know anything I don't.
And given that you are the current CEO of Mindflick, that is a very good reason why you're our first guest.
Exactly.
Because we don't really have any other choice but to invite you on this show. But no, Balls, it is a great pleasure to have you on the show. And I think from my perspective, why it's a good thing to have you on the show first up is, firstly, you've got a great story to tell. But also, as your first guest, if Pete and I show any sort of amateur mistakes as podcasters, then hopefully you will give us a bit of latitude. And by the way, I hope the audience does as well, first time out. But
Definitely.
As we said at the introduction to the podcast, this podcast is really around those significant moments in your life, those turning points which made you see the world differently, significant mindset shifts that you've made in your life, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're really excited to explore that with you, Boards. And why don't we start at the first one? You've obviously had a bit of a time to think about it. Yeah. Let's go straight into your first major turning point.
Thinking about this, obviously a lot of things happened. I grew up in Cornwall. My background was very much in the world of sport when I was growing up in Cornwall. And I think my first key turning point was actually going back to 1989, which is where I feel like I probably had my first key sort of like fork in the road, as it were. And I was an aspiring cricketer, obviously not as good as yourself, Andrew, but I was an aspiring cricketer going through the classic sort of county cricket, trying to get into the England school side, all of that kind of stuff as a young cricketer. And I had dreams of one day playing cricket for England, probably as you did. You fulfilled yours. I didn't mine. And one of the reasons why I didn't, number one, was an absence of talent, clearly. But I experienced something in 1989, which kind of, I guess, changed the way I thought about an awful lot of things, because I was an opening bowler back in my more svelte days, running in, opening the bowling. I'd been bowling to a relatively high level for sort of like 6, 7, 8 years. It was all I knew really, playing cricket. And then one day I was playing in a county game and I ran into bowl, and essentially the ball got stuck in my hand. And it was a really, really strange feeling. I literally bowled the ball. It's stuck in my hand. I bowled the ball. I dragged it down. The batsman dispatched it for 4. And to most people watching that delivery, they would have said that was just a shocking delivery, which of course we're all very capable of. But I knew it felt very different. I didn't feel like I was in control of the ball. I'd never felt that before. I walked back to my mark, ran in, expecting a normal delivery to happen. The same thing happened. Yet the sensation of the ball being stuck was even stronger. Same thing happened. I bowled the ball very short, ball got dispatched to the boundary. And then from that moment on, for the rest of that over, the ball got stuck further and further in my hand for longer and longer, until I was literally running into bowl, saying in my head, let go of the ball. And when I started doing that, the ball started going for wides, no balls. I was bowling over the wicketkeeper's head. And I had this just horrendous experience of being stuck in this over, bowling a series of no balls now, having to repeat the ball. And it was the first over of the match. And I did not know what was going on. And I didn't feel like I could even get out of it. In the end, I literally had to stand in the delivery position and just turn my arm over and let the batsman almost hit the ball back to me. It was shockingly embarrassing. I then went back to the boundary. I didn't get asked to bowl again in that match. Just sat on the boundary, stuck in my own mind whirling, heart racing, thinking, what on earth happened there? That's never happened before. I felt pressure before. I've bowled badly before, but I've never done that. Got to the end of the game, went back to practice, and I bowled beautifully well. Everything was fine. But then I went back to another game on the following Saturday. The same thing happened, but it was worse. And I tried 5 or 6 times. Each time the problem getting worse and worse and worse. At its worst, I bowled a ball backwards, which is pretty hard to do, actually. You try it. It is pretty hard to do that. It was really, really strange. And at that time, it started becoming a bit of a narrative, right? My friends knew about it. My teammates knew about it. They throw me the ball and everyone would sort of dive for cover. It was like, it became a bit of a joke, but I did not know what was going on. I was 17. And bear in mind, at 17, the only thing I really knew was playing cricket. And the only thing I was probably any good at was bowling. So to suddenly find this, it just seemed to have left me overnight, was quite dramatic. I got through that summer without any further improvement, went to winter training. You'll know what that's like, Andrew. I was still part of the England school setup at that time. Went and spoke to the bowling coach. And of course I was bowling fine in the nets, but then I explained to him what my summer had been like. And he just looked at me deadpan and said, I know exactly what's going on for you. You've got the yips. I was just like, the what? What are you talking about? And he said, you've got the yips, son. And I said, well, if that's what I've got, what do I do? What do I do about it? And he looked at me absolutely deadpan, dead straight, and just said, you really need to start batting, because I've never known anyone get over this. And so that really, that moment was a bit of a moment for me of, crikey, I've got dreams of playing cricket for England. That should be the starting point of my sort of my journey as a sports person. And all of a sudden I felt like, crikey, this could be the end of that. And it actually was. Yeah, I did at that time. I came back into the new season unable to bowl, and it sort of stuck with me, which kind of led me on a whole host of different paths, which I'm sure we'll get into. But that was probably my first sort of critical moment, I guess.
Like that comment, Mark, there, that from the coach, which is obviously it's well intended. It sounds a little bit flippant, take up batting, but obviously that represents something far bigger for you, like a shift in how you see yourself, who you are, a shift in identity. Like, how did it feel to be on the receiving end of that? Did it trigger other shifts, or like what was it like to go through that?
I think you kind of don't believe it, really, do you? To think that you could lose that overnight after 10 years work was just, I couldn't quite get my head around it. But the fact that somebody that knew about this stuff has said, I've seen this happen over and over again. Nobody knows why it happens. Nobody knows why you get it. And it was almost like, when he described it to me, it was almost like it was a bit of like a virus, like an illness that you don't really want to talk about too much. I went back and said to my good friends, you know what your teammates are like? They're always the best ones for pure honesty. And I went back to one of my best friends and sort of said, I've got this thing, apparently it's called the yips. And he just looked at me and went, no, it's just crapness. You just, try to. And I
Very
was like,
good,
no,
clean feedback. Yeah.
yeah,
exactly.
clean feedback. And I was like, well, no, I know what bowling bad's like. And all of a sudden, one day to see something you could lose it overnight, I could not get my head around that. But I wanted to know why. That it made me very inquisitive, really.
And it's interesting, Bawden. I mean, you're not far from the only person to have gone through the yips, and we know it's a very common occurrence in golf and darts and all sorts of different sports. Baseball's another one where you hear about it quite often. I have to admit, very quietly, that I've had it occasionally with my putting as well in golf. Thankfully, not in my cricket. It is an intriguing thing, and it's a very hard thing to get your head around. But I wonder, there are a lot of people that sort of get into therapy on the basis of experiencing their own trauma. And I suppose, in a way, this is the sort of precursor to your real interest in psychology and the way the mind works.
100%. Yeah. I mean, my options became pretty limited when all of a sudden cricket sort of disappeared overnight. But what it did give me was, I was fascinated by how this could happen. I knew that this wasn't a physical problem. I knew it was a mental problem, but I knew very little about mindset, about the psychology of performance. I knew that most people said you're just too nervous, but I thought, I know what nerves feel like. This is different. And at that time, this really probably leads to probably the second big sort of turning point for me, which was getting my A-level results, because options have become limited. I now had this passion to find out a little bit about why this had happened to me, and managed to spectacularly fail my A-levels. So now all of a sudden going to university didn't seem like a great option. But luckily for me, in that same year, it was the second year of something called sports studies, which became sports science. And reading through the brochures, I saw that it talked about this thing, sports psychology. I didn't even know it was a thing. Didn't even know it existed. But I was like, that sounds like the kind of thing that's going to help in some way me understand what's happened to me and experiencing the yips. And so the actual result was I didn't get the qualifications to get into a university to do sports studies. In the end, very embarrassingly, and this is probably a bit of a critical moment, is that my mum decided to do that for me. So she picked up the phone and literally begged them to let me get into uni, which I did. Got in the next day, started a sports studies degree, really with the goal of studying sports psychology so that I could find out what happened. All of a sudden, learning became fascinating. I'd found academia very hard, but when I got to do sports studies, I found something I was really passionate about. The mind, how that can overpower performance. I sort of felt like I'd found my niche a little bit there.
I always find that interesting, that bit when you've gone from, I see myself, I'm not an academic, but now I'm seeing myself as like this disciplined learner. Like I can learn this if I apply myself to it. But often we need to build our confidence sometimes in that kind of space. Like, where did you get your confidence from, or how did that grow over time? Because, coming in there off the back of the A-levels, maybe it wasn't there, but somehow that's built, right?
Yeah, well, I think it was the first time you talk about feedback. You always said your best friends give you feedback. I mean, I've had very little positive feedback associated with academia, but I think it was the first time where I've always been someone who had lots of ideas. I like to talk, as you know. I like to come up with my ideas about things. And for the first time in psychology, it felt like the discipline one where your opinion mattered. Where if you had an idea about something, someone said, that's interesting, not that's wrong. And I think I probably just got my first taste of positive feedback. A guy called Ian Maynard, who was the professor of sports psychology there, he was the one who let me in. He took a bit of a punt on me and sort of said, like, as long as you come and you work hard, because you're good at sport, you'll find a way of doing this, and you can get a degree. And he gave me an awful lot of confidence because he sort of believed in me a little bit before time, really. And then that led to him, when I finished my degree, the opportunity came up to then say, would you like to do a PhD? Do some doctoral research in sports psychology. Again, which was a great affirmation for, you're doing all right. This is a good discipline for you. Again, coming from Ian. And he asked me, what do you want to study? And of course I said, there's only one thing I want to study, and that's the yips. And of course he came back to me and said, they don't exist. It's a myth. They don't.
I beg to differ, right?
So do I, by the way. Yeah.
I've got them and they feel very real. But that's why I ended up doing a PhD in the yips. Where did I get my confidence from? Probably the first time someone said, actually, your opinion is valuable in this discipline. And then someone else validated that by saying, you could take it further.
Just give the audience an idea here, Boards, as to what extent you were at the forefront of performance sports psychology, because psychology has been around for a long time, we obviously are all aware of that. But certainly in my early days playing sport, there was a real sort of degree of sort of cynicism, skepticism, and probably to a degree sort of downright antagonism to psychology, because people felt like it was complicating, it was mumbo jumbo, it was opening a can of worms, etc., etc. I mean, when you started talking about this, were there people that were already fully engaged in the idea of using psychology to maximize performance, or was it very much at its genesis?
Well, it was in its early stages, but what people did when I started in the sort of early 90s was, you combined academia with an applied sports psychology practice. So it was usually the academics that went out and delivered performance psychology. And in fact, that's how I learned. I did my PhD, which I did obviously in the hips, as I said. The other half of my time, I was learning practice, working actually at that time with the England table tennis team, which is where I learned my craft. So they let you at that stage, you learn the skills of being a performance psychologist on the ground with a national team. That's the sort of stage we were at. It certainly wasn't in the place where it was an accepted norm that every team would have a sports psychologist. You definitely, when you rocked up as a sports psych in those days, there was a lot of people that would hide and be dreading you walking up and asking how they were, etc. It was very much the early stages, but just as with academia, with sports science becoming a thing, it was starting to become a discipline. It was very much at that sort of starting phase. The idea of being a full-time sports psychologist in a sport and being paid at that time was not very prevalent at all. That was a thing to come.
But that's not easy, is it? Because on the one hand, you're sort of learning it yourself, and on the other hand, you're having to sort of overcome that sort of resistance, I suppose. It's not like you're walking into a team like you would today, who are all used to having a sports psychologist there. They sort of understand the benefits by and large. They don't see it as a case of the sort of head doctor coming to cure my mind that's gone horribly awry, etc. So I suppose it was, quite a challenging environment to step into at the outset.
You still have to do this now, but you definitely had to earn your stripes. You all had to recognize that you respected the environment you're going into. You understood that environment, that you recognized how your skills would fit. And definitely there was a perception that a sports psychologist was there simply to fix problems. He was there to solve what wasn't working well. And I think that's changed dramatically, like over time. That's still part of what a good performance psychologist would do. But I think that perception obviously has changed a lot. Fast forward, obviously I did the PhD in the yips, which was really just about getting the yips on the map. But at the same time, like I said, was sort of learning my craft, and I got a chance to work in a lot of different sports. But given that I come to sports psychology through my experience of the yips, sports psychology felt like a very much a reactive thing. It felt like it was working with problems and fixing problems. And certainly with the yips, that is definitely the case. Someone's coming to you with an issue and they want to get over that. And I think there was a probably a critical moment quite early in my more applied career, which sort of really profoundly stuck with me, which was actually working in one of the sports, probably the sport I've enjoyed working with the most. Sorry, Straussy. It's short track speed skating, actually. It was a sport I knew nothing about, never done. And when I watched it, it was phenomenal, 35 miles an hour on ice, go as fast as you can, keep turning left, making decisions. Phenomenal sport. But I was brought in to work with a specific short track speed skater, one on the female team, a girl called Lindsay, who was, really good at what she did. She was in the top 12 in the world, around that area. But, the issue that I was working with Sarah was trying to help her overcome sort of like decision making under pressure. Essentially, that's what were the areas we were working on, and we spent a long time looking at various different techniques over the course of a training season on how we can help her make those decisions in a way that was much less conscious. And I could give you the interventions. We went through so many things, everything from classic mental skills, using imagery, to taking responsibility away from her, to the coaches, looking at less conscious methods of decision making. But But the net result was, by the end of that season, her performance had got worse. And it wasn't until we sat down with her and her coach and we reviewed her progress, we reflected on how is it that we've been working on these skills over the course of the whole season, and the problems maintained. And in fact, it's probably got worse because, she's not even particularly motivated to come to training now because she's training on something, she doesn't enjoy, that she's not very good at. And we were talking about this one area that she was not great at, as if it was the big block to her moving forward. And I just sort of stopped the conversation when it was going particularly badly and just sort of said, tell me about what you're most proud of. What's your greatest strength in short track? We've spent a long time talking about what's not working. It took a long time for her to sort of reflect on what her greatest strength was. But when she did, she started talking about her start, being very powerful, being quite aggressive for a female skater. And all of a sudden I saw her body language change, her mindset shifted. You could see her eyes shining again, talking about this could be something that could be a real game changer for me if I really invested in it. And I sort of sat there and I thought, how much time do we invest in this area? And it was pretty much the same as everything else that she was training. So we took the focus away from the one thing that wasn't working and put it onto the thing that she was thought could give her that greatest leap. And to cut a very long story short, that gave her a strength that made her want to train. She came in every day. She was more focused. She was certainly getting a lot more out of her racing. And the problem that we were working on sort of drifted away is because her confidence has grown. It was really quite powerful to see how focusing on something that was working and something that could be really great, really almost that area improved, but it also lifted up everything else. And it just made me think, how much time do we spend working on all the things that aren't working when actually growing some of the things that are could make such a big difference?
It sounds like a really subtle thing, but it's such a profound thing, isn't it, to make that shift? If we were to ask you to give a bit of advice then to kind of a leader maybe listening to the podcast in terms of making that sort of shift, like what advice would it be? What should they stop doing? What should they start doing?
Yeah, well, I think sometimes it's the most basic thing is that what I have learned from working with athletes is the things that they are best at, they're often blind to. And you need other people to notice that. And yet it's very, very tempting to notice and to draw attention to things that aren't working.
Yeah.
They aren't the things. If you get those things working, they will improve you for sure. Yeah, improving those areas. But they're very rarely the things that are going to make the real difference. They're going to take you to world's best or, create a massive change the dial moment in performance. And so for leaders, I would say taking time in the people you lead or the teams you lead to look at what's working and how do we make it better. Because those things don't always scream at you, and the people that experience those things don't always notice them or even value them sometimes. But sometimes those strengths, they're just lying dormant there, and we can invest so much effort in trying to fix the things that we think are broken. Sometimes finding the things that are working and making them better could be the thing that actually will make the difference to performance overall.
It's interesting in sport because your successes and failures are so public. It's so easy to get trapped in that mindset of, if I fail, I just need to make sure I don't repeat that failure. I always used to have it in cricket. If I got out a certain way, next time I went out to bat, I was almost doubly determined not to get out the same way again. So you're automatically in that slightly negative mindset of, I can't make a mistake. I need to make sure I don't repeat a mistake, etc., etc. And that's why that sort of mindset shift is so crucial. Taking it away from what might go wrong, thinking much more about what might go right and what works for you. What's the foundation of your success? We obviously talked a lot about that in the England Creed team while you're involved, but it's something that doesn't necessarily come naturally. And that's the interesting thing about it.
100%. You need to almost invest effort. It needs to be purposeful effort to get into that world.
The mindset's kind of naturally drawn there, though. It's like when you get your report card, when you get your GCSE results or your A-level results or whatever the thing is, as you say, Andrew, the setbacks seem to hit harder than the successes quite often. So the eye naturally goes there. So I love that phrase you said earlier, discipline, to be focused on the things that are working and growing, because your eye will naturally get drawn to the other stuff as well.
And so everyone else's eye tends to look more at what's not working. And it's not to say you don't acknowledge that stuff. You definitely do, but it's rarely the stuff that makes the big differences.
Excellent. Very good. Boards, let's go on to the next turning point.
I think the next lesson or turning point for me probably is more a personal one rather than a sort of career one. 2003, my dad died very suddenly. Literally, we were on a bike ride on a Friday. He sort of got off the bike, acted a bit strange, didn't look himself, sort of face dropped to one side. And by the start of the following week, he was on was life support and not brought round. That was a really profound moment for me, which is a couple of massive messages in there, because my dad's philosophy, whilst Ian Maynard's philosophy was always don't give up, my dad's philosophy was always do the things you love. He used to say to me that thing around, make your hobby your job, because then you don't worry about going to work and all those kind of things. I always find that slightly ironic in that my dad worked in a custard factory, but he was, but he managed the factory and he loved it. He loved every minute of it. He loved being a manager. He was passionate about Ambrosia where he worked. And so he's instilled that very much in me. Make your hobby your job. And at that stage, very much, I was starting to, take that very much on board, which is, I can turn the applied world of sports psychology into more of a life sort of profession rather than something I do alongside an academic job. I suppose at that time we were incredibly lucky because, again, I feel like I've been very fortunate all the way down this timeline because there's a lot of firsts, but that's when the English Institute of Sport opened up, where we were going to bring a lot of the elite sports together, bring a lot of sports scientists together under one roof. And then another first, right on the back of that, we won 2012. So I got a role at the English Institute of Sport. I was lucky enough to be able to head up the sports psychology team. And we basically had the task really on the back of that was preparing Team GB for London 2012. And Pete, you'll remember all about this. We had some fun and games preparing that team. But what was really interesting was we knew that our home games could be a wonderful force multiplier for performance. You've got the pressure of a home games, but it's also that's energy, right? Or it could go the other way. And we know our media, tends to like a story and get on board with the negative side of things quite quickly. So they invested heavily in supporting our teams, from a leadership point of view, from a teamwork point of view, individual athlete preparation, to get our teams ready for the pressure of a home games and to not just to survive pressure, but to use pressure in a really positive way. So we had the chance to, and this is really where I connected with Pete, even though I'd met him previously at Hallam University. This is where Pete and I's careers kind of combined at the Institute. And we had the opportunity to create and innovate and think differently about how we might go about, preparing those teams for London 2012. And that's when sports psychology became, for me anyway, very much an accepted norm. I mean, every Olympic sport had access to a sports psychologist. Your athletes didn't cringe when you said you're the sports psychologist anymore. They tended to think you might be someone who's, can help find that extra 1 or 2% that would make a difference. So the critical thing around that time was probably an experience that we had not with a Olympic sport though. The short track experience had taught me that even though I came into psychology because of essentially problem-based experiences, I realized in performance psychology, you can offer so much more when you're working on what's working well and making it grow in teams and individuals. And then I had an experience with a squash player called Nick Matthew, who was based at the EIS in Sheffield, and he's working across all the different sports sciences. But unfortunately for Nick, this is 2008 now, he had an injury which was potentially career-threatening at the time. Not done a lot of work on his psychology, but was a phenomenal athlete, phenomenally talented, sort of stuck around number 8 in the world. And he just knocked on my door one day and said, I see you working with a lot of these Olympic sports. I'd like to spend a bit of time reflecting on my psychology. I've not really had a chance to do it. I've got given this it's either a curse or an opportunity. I've got 6 to 8 months to think about my game that I never would have had. Can we work on the mental side? And sure enough, Nick said, my goal is I want to one day become, world champion, but I've been stuck at this sort of position for a long period of time. We decided to do a traditional performance profile. You remember these, Pete, the old school performance profile, get all the aspects of performance, technically, tactically, physically, mentally, and get his coach himself and his training partner to score him against world's best. If you want to be the best in the world, where are you in relation to that? And we did this exercise and we got everyone's profiles. We put them out on the floor, and Nick came back after I collected all the data, and every profile told the same story. every profile, when they looked at it, was almost a perfect circle. Everyone had graded everything 8.5 or 9 out of 10. Everything. And Nick was like, see, I'm pretty good at everything. And then we had this little like reframe moment of pretty good at everything, or world's best at nothing. He kind of looked at that and went, yeah, that's the point. Like, every other person in the rankings, I can tell you what their world's best strength is. I don't have one. And he used that time to combine a world's best super strength effectively, so that when he came back into training again, he would harness something that would give him a competitive edge. And this was something that was really powerful, because now it wasn't just using strengths to find what's working. It's finding strengths to create a world-winning edge. And, Nick's story, which he tells far better than me, what happened when he came back into playing was phenomenal. He went on like a 68 winning match spree. He spent 2 years at number 1 in the world, became world champion 3 times. He's like, and he had all the bits of the jigsaw, but what he just didn't have was that world winning edge. And when he found that, it just set him free. And that, again, sort of like changed philosophy and practice and how you think about things. What's the thing that you've got in your armory that's really going to give you the edge?
Mark, when you think about that, 'cause for Nick, you've got a subtle shift there, right? From, I'm good at everything, 8 out of 10 everything, but I'm not world class at anything. And that journey you took him on to focus in that way on something he could be. But it led to huge success, a huge shift in performance. Like, what do you put that down to when you've reflected on it? What was the thing that change in focus drove within Nick?
The first thing to say is, like, Nick was a phenomenal athlete across the whole board. But I think one of his strengths that lay there all the time was his discipline. He was so disciplined. When he put his mind to something, he really focused on developing it. And when he stepped back on the court, he wanted to know that he had an edge over his competitors that gave him that special piece of difference. And when he thought about himself competing against other opponents, quite often when I said, what player X you think when you step on the court? He said, they probably think I'm pretty good at everything and I've got a strong engine and I just need to get my strengths out. Whereas now I've actually, more than just playing to my strengths, I've got a tactic to win. I've got something I'm trying to do. I'm not reacting to them now. I know what I need to do to them. So the whole mindset shifted. And I think it was very powerful for him. But it only worked because of the discipline that Nick had and the belief that I've worked hard on all these areas, and maybe mindset might be the one that gives me a little extra edge at the end.
Just to add a bit to this, Mark, because we talked a lot about this whole sort of super strength concept within the career team. There is a sort of slight bit of depth to this, because it's not as simple as saying to everyone out there, right, you just need to find one thing that you're better at than everyone else in the world at, and you're going to be fine. The truth is, sport filters out weaknesses pretty well. So if you have a significant weakness, you're probably not going to get through to the next level. So just explain to me this sort of relationship between super strengths and weaknesses as well, because it's important to understand that.
A strengths-based focus is not go out and play to your strengths and enjoy it. It's really use your strengths smartly. If you think about a boat, for example, if you've got holes below the waterline, you've got a sinking boat, right? You need to fix those things. They're going to expose you. You're not going to be high performance when you've got holes below the waterline. But if you've got damage above the waterline that's not sinking your boat, it's not 100%. It's not the thing that's going to make a massive difference, but you've got damage above the waterline. They're like your weaknesses. Now, those things can often take up a lot of our attention. They can draw our attention there because other people will point to them and say they are not as good as X or Y. Yet the thing you've got to remember is you've also got these sails. You've got these beautiful sails, which are your natural resources, your natural strengths, that when used in the right context are the thing that make a difference for you. And I think that sometimes we spend too much time looking at the damage above the water level at the expense of the sails. Now, that doesn't mean you don't fix it when you've got a hole in your boat. Because if you've got a hole in the boat and you release your sails, you just sink really fast. It just means you sink quicker. What I think people perceive sometimes is damage above the waterline as being holes in their boat. And they think by fixing those, they're going to get high performance. They fix those and they've got now a sturdy boat. What they actually need is they need to actually release the thing that's going to transform them and take them forward. And going back to our boat metaphor, your sails are like represent your strengths, but the spinnaker, the sail that you use in the right conditions at the right time, is very much your super strength. It has to be used really smartly. You don't just use it willy-nilly, you use it in the right context. And so many people don't even know what their strengths and sails are. They're boxed away whilst they're busy fixing things that aren't going to make a massive difference.
I love that, Mark. That kind of, it's a shift in attention, isn't it? It's where you're spending your limited attention and time and that kind of thing. But you described another shift earlier with Nick, and I think it applies here as well, is it sometimes leads to a shift in the opposition as well when you find that edge.
100%, because you're walking, he's walking onto the court knowing what he's trying to do. Now, rather than them just walking onto the court thinking that they've got to try and put their strategy onto you, they're now coming on very guarded, right? They're thinking, I need to make sure he doesn't do that. It changes the whole game, right? It changes the whole game and changes your tactics. And I think, Andrew, this probably links to our stuff, which is where we met was obviously with England cricket, 2009, 2010, with the goal of trying to get the England cricket team, being part of that team, trying on that journey to number one in the world. And on the back of like strengths-based experiences, chance encounter for me with Andy Flower, the head coach at the time, meant that I got the opportunity to come in and be part of the team and grow that strengths-based approach. I suppose if you think about the cycle of life, where I had my little pinch me moment, if you like, was, walking, going to the Ashes in 2010, having just really recently joined the team. And, having that conversation with you, Andrew, about areas that you might want to work on in your game. And, you saying, well, actually, I don't think I'm all right actually at the moment with my cricket. It's my golf that's struggling, and I could do a bit of help with the yips, And I was thinking, crikey, we have gone full circle here. This is right back to the yips where I began.
I'm hoping that's not one of the significant turning points in your life there, Mark. But
what was significant, I guess, was, our journey was very much then trying to work with a team and look at the collective team strengths and the strategy that comes from that, and growing individual strengths to become best in the world. And I think the big profound lesson, without going into, because you can talk about England cricket far better than I can, but I think the profound lesson we learned there is getting a team to win and getting a team to number one in the world, is obviously a tough ask for anyone, but you achieve that brilliantly well. I think the question you and I asked afterwards was, how do you get a team to win after winning? How do you sustain that without the whole thing falling apart and then having to rebuild and start again? And that was something else that really sort of stuck with me, which was, high performance is not a one-off event. It's not a one-off moment in time. It's a mindset and a philosophy that's ingrained beyond just the people in it. I think that's what I took from cricket.
The interesting thing to that England cricket team that I was captaining, that we did a lot of work on, was understanding that our super strength really was around sort of suffocating opposition teams, not allowing them to score, almost on the surface, looking very negative, setting very defensive fields, because that's what we had in Anderson and Broad and Bresnan and Swan, etc. So we understood that was our point of difference, our super strength, and we committed to it and we executed it well, and we got to number one in the world. The interesting thing about the current England team is obviously everyone's talking about Bazball. That is their super strength. It's a very different way of playing. They've got their sails up. They can beat the best teams in the world playing that way. But what works in one context with one group of people does not necessarily work in another context with another group of people as well. And so, that's why it's so important to continue this sort of culture of learning, of questioning, of understanding that team dynamic and how sort of fragile and constantly moving it is.
The context piece is absolutely critical. And that's why you can't just take a model from one team and plonk it straight into another, because essentially you're dealing with the people in that system and their combined strengths, and also the context that those strengths are operating in, how the world is shifted. I think, you were one of the, you reflected to me, Andrew, that actually you felt like some of the opposition actually started to use our super strength better than we could, and we didn't adapt. We didn't spot the context changing and the environment changing. So yeah, context is king.
So I think we're up to about 2012 now, Boards, and what's the next one for us?
Yeah, 2013 is probably where the Mindflick moment came. Obviously, Pete and I's connection was very much through our time at the English Institute of Sport, working with the Team GB leading into the games. It was quite powerful because around this time, my son had a kidney transplant. So I had the opportunity to be able to give Harry, my son, my kidney, which was, a phenomenal thing to be able to do. And if ever you want to watch teams working brilliantly well, we talk about sport. If you go and watch one of those, intensive care teams or those surgical teams working, my word, you get to see what teams without ego really look like. Phenomenal. But that experience actually really sort of centered me a little bit, because up until 2011, 2012, I'd spent a lot of time doing what I loved, which was being a sports psychologist, traveling with Olympic and professional sports teams, very talented athletes. It was great. But when something like that happens, when it brings you right back to earth. And I think one of the things that the message I took there is I needed to be very close to home from now on. I wanted to be a lot more local. If I wanted to continue my love and passion of psychology in doing that, it wasn't going to be at the back of a sports coach somewhere on the other side of the world anymore. It was going to be a lot closer to home and a lot closer to family. Then we had 2012, which was the games. At the end of those games, which were incredibly successful, the athletes did phenomenally well, as did Pete and I. Sort of sat down there, and you have that moment, don't you, after a big campaign where you have a chance to reflect for a second. Where were we, Pete? We were sat in. I was trying to work it out earlier on.
We were in the Olympic Village. They had the little street food shack. So we're actually sat in a chicken shack, surrounded by elite athletes. And me and you were stuffing chicken down, I think.
That's right. Yeah. In true form. I guess we had a chance to just reflect a little bit on the journey we had. And Pete and I have always had lots of ideas, very passionate about the discipline of psychology, particularly performance psychology. And I guess when we sat down and reflected on the journey we had been on, the really massive interventions that we'd put in place weren't really the things that we felt made much of a difference. It was often the small little interventions delivered at the right time, in the right way, by the right person. Those really small little nudges were like the things that made the difference. And also, I think we reflected it wasn't really sport that was our passion. The psychology of change was what we were really interested in, because it was fascinating seeing how some people seemingly change really fast over time, or how change was possible when you had this really impressive goal to try and achieve. It got us really into this idea of, how do you change fast? You don't get a lot of time to change with people. When you work in sport, you get very small windows. But we felt like, actually, what we'd learned is it's small changes done in the right way that make the really big differences. And the route to doing that is understanding your mindset. And most of what we'd been taught over time was that, behavior change takes time, which it does. But then we would direct our interventions at behavior. Whereas actually we realized, if you can shift mindset, you can shift mindset in a moment, the way you view a situation, which can change a whole host of the ways that you look at situations. And so it was a combination really of this journey that we'd shared and both been on, going through the games. Pete Wolfs had spent time in professional sport, working in football, etc. And we got this bit and we were like, there's something around this idea of small change, big differences, shifts in mindset. And then it was your point, Andrew, which was probably where, the three of us combined, which was, why is this stuff that you work on just really for the super elite, helping them get a bit better at stuff they're already brilliant at? Why couldn't it be used much more widely across anyone that's trying to reach their potential or perform better? And really, that's where I suppose the idea of Mindflick was born, which is, how can you make small changes in mindset to make big differences, like en masse, on scale, that don't require a sports psychologist wandering around with you all the time, which is what we'd done with our sports teams. And really, that, I think, is where Mindflick was born. You guys might have different recollection of that. It may have been organised by you two in the pub, and you just let me know about it.
It pretty much tallies. Yeah, it pretty much tallies. Just to come on, because it's quite an important point you made there, Mark, the difference between that focus on behaviour, the focus on mindset, the difference between like the kind of doing, as you were describing, that kind of viewing. For kind of people listening, like, how do you, behaviour is easy to spot. How do you spot mindset in someone? How would you know someone's mindset? Would you be able to guess it? Like, how's that work?
Yeah. Well, mindset's trickier, isn't it? Because mindset, the way people view situations, doesn't scream at you in the same way as you could observe someone's behavior. But when you think about mindset and the tool that we went on to develop, which looks at mindset, what it gets into is things like, some people will view the world through a very optimistic lens. Other people will view the world through a very prudent lens. Now, the way you'd see that mindset is things like the way they would respond to success and setbacks, the way they might choose to set goals or not, as the case may be. They give you little clues. You have to listen to the language to understand mindset, rather than just observe behaviors. So mindset sort of whispers away in the background, whereas behavior is very much at the front. But if you take two athletes, both of them are very outcome driven, very results focused, very fast, like making decisions quickly, very results orientated, highly competitive. But one of them's got a mindset where they're, I guess, looking through a lens of optimism, believing that you win by grabbing opportunities, finding the performance edges, being prepared to take a risk, managing risk as their strength, compared to someone else who's exactly the same behaviorally, fast-paced, task-orientated, very competitive, outcome-driven, all those very, very similar fast-paced, action-orientated behavioral traits. But then their mindset is prudent. I believe you win by not making mistakes, by doing the basics brilliantly well, by looking ahead and seeing where the threats are around the corner and making sure I'm ready. Those two athletes, whilst they look the same in terms of their behaviors, their mindset and what they're controlling for are actually opposites. So understanding that about the athletes you're working with, or understanding that about the people you're working with, is critical in the way in which they will perform. And before, I think we only really looked at it through the behavioral lens, which didn't always give us the best insight.
I mean, it's really interesting, and that mindset sort of philosophy just felt instinctively so important in the world of cricket. I think people that come from that sort of prudent thinking about what might go wrong, often they were sort of perceived as sort of negative people in the environment. They're always thinking about what might go wrong. They're sort of a handbrake on progress, etc., etc. And so understanding, I think this is a journey that I went on as England captain and then as director in cricket, understanding and appreciating difference. Everyone's viewing the world in a slightly different way, and there's no right or wrong. But of course, the challenge for a leader in any environment is, how do you bring all these people together and make sure that they are able to form a cohesive team based on different viewpoints in the world? And that's what we've really tried to do at Mindflick, isn't it? Is both the work we do in delivery, but also the products that we developed, is trying to build stronger relationships, really, which is the foundation to any high-performing team.
100%. I know people have lots of strong thoughts on this, but for me, from my perspective, I think there is an interesting challenge that we've got, which is around empathy. It can seem like a soft skill that you need to have, but actually understanding where other people are coming from is absolutely fundamental to maximizing performance. But I think a challenge for the modern leader definitely is that the world is one which encourages us to polarize opinion often, to say whether we like or dislike things, to be able to thumbs up things or thumbs down things, to be on the left or the right or whatever. So often it's very clear cut. And then when you're a leader and you're asked to bring teams together, you want them not to be polarized and to look at each other's differences as black and white. You want to, that diversity is good, or cognitive diversity is great, and you want them to be working in the gray areas. You want them to be looking at differences as strength. And I think teams that are working well will see differences as strength through the ups and downs. Teams that work less well are ones that, will tolerate each other's differences when things are good. But when they're under pressure and performance is really needed, that's when you start seeing all of a sudden the same perception of strengths flipping into weakness. And you start seeing more of that polarized behavior. But you think about how important that is now, given that, if the outside world is more polarized, you've got these little microcosms in your teams of people where you want them to do the opposite of what the outside world's encouraging. You've got to be purposeful in creating that, because the temptation else is to operate in a similar kind of way. What do you think, Pete?
100% agree. I think the thing you described there is like giving people a language and a way of being able to talk about that difference in a strength-based way. It kind of comes back kind of to some of your earlier moments, really, of like we see things in one way, a subtle shift, and all of a sudden it unlocks potential. We don't see that as negative. We see it as spotting threat early. That's exactly what we need teams to do, to value those differences and get the best out of people.
Yeah.
Well, listen, I am very conscious that the three of us could be talking about this all day long. In fact, we spend most of our days talking about this stuff. But the audience probably only has so much time that they can give us for this podcast. So just to wrap things up, Boards, the one final question for you, and it may be connecting back to what we've just talked about there, but if there is one thing you'd like listeners to take away from your story that you've shared with us today, what would that be?
Actually, I think it's even your biggest setbacks might be your biggest opportunity. Because if you look at my story, I think beginning to where we are now, that initial setback I experienced probably is the thing that's driven all of that curiosity over time. And so I think in those things that we perceive as being setbacks probably lies our greatest opportunity for growth.
Well, that is a very good way to finish, Board, and a very profound statement, no doubt. Thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully the audience has got a little bit of a flavour here for what we're going to try and push on when we have further guests, which is this idea of these significant moments in your life, but also the way we think, the way our mindset shifts over time, and of course the lessons that we learn from all the experiences that we have, which is exactly what you talked about there. So Mark, a massive thanks for joining us on episode 1 of the podcast.
Yeah, thanks guys. Good luck, and I'm sure it's going to be great going forward. You can get the real guests on next, the real superstars.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
Right.
Cheers.
Cheers.